So there's these rumors running around that the government is going to take our pension fund money. So everything we've saved our whole life is just going to be gobbled up by the government. They're going to take the pension fund money and invest it how they see fit. Now, first and foremost, it's not as bad as that. So the government is not going to come and take your pension fund money. So I just want to put that on the table to start off with, so that everybody can just relax. You don't have to run out of the country. It's not going to be as bad as that. Saying that, does that mean there's no threat and there's no negatives? No, there's a lot of negatives, and I'll touch on that as well. So the rumors that are running around, and what actually is going to happen is that the government want to use prescribed assets to invest in state-owned enterprises. So state-owned enterprises like, for example, Eskom, Telkom, SAA, all of these companies that we know how well they are doing at the moment, Sunroll, all of these guys. So in the sense that if you just look at that, it's not a really motivational system or something that gets us all excited to think that the government wants to prescribe assets to invest in these companies. But let's first look at what the meaning is of prescribed assets. Prescribed assets is where the government forces investors to put a percentage of their investments into certain companies, certain assets, certain infrastructure products that are usually owned by the government, owned and managed by the government. So that is what is called prescribed assets. So they basically prescribe where you are allowed to invest your assets. Okay, so that's prescribed assets. Now, how would the government be able to do that? How can they just go and prescribe that? So there's already regulation or in effect that already prescribes what people can and cannot do with their money that they save for retirement. And that regulation came into effect in April of 2011 already. And that is called Regulation 28. So Regulation 28 has been with us for the last 9 years. And that regulates where people can invest their money and cannot for pension funds. So it specifically regulates pension funds. And the idea behind Regulation 28 was to limit the risk that people are allowed to take with their pension fund money. So what it does is it limits how much money you can invest, or a pension fund, you and your own retirement annuity, pension fund trustees, all of these guys, how much they can invest in a specific asset class. Now, I'm going to not go into too much detail. I'm just quickly going to explain what it says at the moment. So as it stands at the moment, Regulation 28, you cannot invest more than 75% of your assets, your money sitting in your pension fund, into equities. So you cannot increase it more than 75%. Now, for those of you who don't know, equities are basically shares in companies. Okay, so equities you can't put more than 75% in. Property, you can't put in more than 25% of your money into a property fund. You can't put more than 30% of your money in offshore assets, and you can't put more than 10% in hedge funds. So that is the simplistic view of it. There's a lot of different permutations, like, for example, equities and properties can't be more than a specific percentage combined, etc., etc. But the gist of it is that with Regulation 28 and your retirement annuity in your pension fund, you cannot exceed these limits. The challenge that that creates is not only when you take out the retirement annuity or you start the pension fund where it has to comply with Regulation 28, it is during the lifetime of this fund, you can never not comply with Regulation 28. And that creates a problem in and of itself. And I'll explain that quickly. So let's say, for example, you put money into the maximum you can into equities and the maximum you can into property. Suddenly, over the next 2 years, properties are performing very well, which has not been the case. But let's not chat about that. But let's say properties are performing very well. The equity market is not doing that well. What then would mean is your property fund would outperform your equity fund. What that's going to then create is that your property fund will exceed the minimum percentage that you are allowed, which means you now have to correct that in the fund. So that's when you get a letter from the insurance company or your pension fund. Usually in pension funds, the trustees of the pension fund make those changes. You don't even know about those changes. But in your retirement annuity, you then get a letter from your insurance company that says your retirement annuity is no longer Regulation 28 compliant, which then means you have to change the funds. Usually your broker or your financial advisor should help you with that. The problem with that is that basically forces you to sell shares in the funds that are doing well and go and buy shares in the funds that are not doing well. So it's forcing you to take money from funds that are performing very well and putting that money over into funds that are not performing very well, which you can understand. I think most of you can understand that that's not a very good thing. You don't want to take money when it's performing well and put it into places where it's not performing well. But that is Regulation 28, and we've been stuck with that since 2011 already. Now, there is method to the madness behind Regulation 28, and that is to safeguard people to not in the last couple of years of their retirement have all their monies in equities and then the equity market crashes, almost like what now happened with the COVID lockdown, where all the markets went down dramatically. And then people have to retire and they have no time for this to recover. It's to limit the risk in those funds. So the easiest way that the government would be able to use prescribed assets and to compel pension funds and retirement annuity funds to invest in these state-owned enterprises is by changing Regulation 28. So what they would then do is they would change the laws regarding Regulation 28, and they will compel funds to invest in government bonds. So government bonds are basically the government giving out bonds where people invest in those bonds, and that is like a loan. So you basically loan money to the government, and you get a bond rate where the government pays those loans back over a period of 5 years, 10 years, etc., etc. Okay, so what they would do, the easiest way for them to prescribe these assets is to say that a percentage of every pension fund, retirement annuity fund has to be invested into government bonds. Okay, now, how much money are in these funds? So how much money is that? And then you can understand why the government is thinking that this could be a place for them to find funding for their infrastructure projects. So currently, ASISA, the Assurance Institute of South Africa, estimate that in pension savings in South Africa, all the funds combined have about 6.2 trillion rand sitting in pension funds at the moment. Now, just quickly wrap your head around that one. 6.2 trillion rand sitting in pension funds. So obviously that is a nice little piggy bank where money is or could be available for development and all the other things they say they want to do with the money. But what is the possible percentages? What could the government potentially say to Regulation 28 to compel funds to put money into government bonds? Now, we just have to look back in history because it's not the first time in our history that prescribed assets have been used to compel pension funds to invest in government bonds. Since from 1958 to 1989, the previous government, the apartheid government, couldn't get funding offshore because of all the sanctions and all of those kind of things. So what they did is they used prescribed assets for the country, for the pension funds to invest in government projects through government bonds. So at that point, the private funds, so most of you that are not employed by the government or government employees pension fund would be in a private retirement fund. The private funds had to put money into the government bonds from the level of about 33% up to about 53%. So it varied over that period of time. So anything between 33% of all money and 53% of all money had to go into government bonds. The government employees pension fund was compelled to invest at least 75% of their money into government bonds and government infrastructure projects. So that is very, very high. I personally think that it will not be that high when government, or if government, and we'll talk about what I think is the chances of this happening. I don't think it will be that high. My estimate would be that it's going to be anything between about 10 to 15% of pension funds. Now, again, you can look at that, and 10% of 6 trillion rand is a hell of a kitty to be able to get access to. So I think it would be between 10% or close to 10% for private funds, and probably up to 15% for government employees' pension funds. Okay. So what are the potential positives of this? Why could it be, or what could be positive about prescribed assets and the government getting access to these funds? The first thing is it could potentially solve our financial crisis that we are in at the moment. Because what would happen is the government will have access to large amounts of money, which they can then push into infrastructure development and infrastructure development projects. Those projects in turn will create thousands and thousands of jobs because it's new projects that gets developed. Our country's infrastructure will improve, which has a positive ripple effect through the whole economy, and that could help kickstart the economy. So that is a potential positive. The second positive is the government will then have access to borrow money at much lower rates than they could from the IMF and the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So because we've been downgraded to junk status, I think most of you know that we've been downgraded to junk status last year, or in the lockdown. Because of that, our rates that we get if we want to borrow money from the IMF and the World Bank has become much higher. So it's much more expensive for the government to pay back those loans. So this will give the government an option on putting money or getting access to cash at much lower rates than they would from the IMF and the World Bank. That in turn will help keep inflation in check a little bit. So it won't be those high amounts that gets had to be paid in interest, which makes it easier for the government to keep a little bit of a track of the inflation rate. So those are two of the main positives. So what's the negatives? So I have like two positives and a whole arm length full of negatives. So let's get started on all the negatives. So the first one is, yes, it can help the country's negative, the financial crisis we are sitting in. It can help. My problem is it won't. And I'm going to explain why. And I think all of us know why. We've got the scourge of corruption. We've got mismanagement in SOEs. We've got misappropriation of funds, overspending on infrastructure projects, where the project was supposed to cost 1 billion, it ends up at 4 billion. All of these things will negate any of the positive effects that this money could potentially have on the country's economy. The problem with that is that unless the government really goes out and stops this, stops the corruption, make sure that the management of these SOEs and these infrastructure development projects are there on merit and are the people that can actually run this effectively. Make sure that when tenders are given and suppliers are appointed, that it is at market-related prices and not these inflated prices. The money will never have the positive effect that it could have. And unfortunately, I don't believe the political will is there to get those things right before this happens. It's like trying to put a plaster on a massive gaping wound. They're just taking another plaster and putting it on and hoping that the wound will solve itself. It's not going to solve itself unless they take the symptoms and solve the symptoms first. The second negative is that the moment this happens, the moment that the government forces pension funds to invest a specific percentage of money into the bond market, that is going to flood the bond market with cash. Now, you know, supply and demand. The more money coming in, the less the demand. Does that make sense? So what then happens is, because there's this massive flood of money coming into the bond market, because all these funds are now forced to put that money into the bond market, bond rates are going to tank. Bond rates are going to drop dramatically because there's more money. They don't need to go and find money and pay people higher interest rates, which means that the investors, which is you guys, the government employees pension fund, the pension funds, their returns will become much, much lower and will probably fall to below inflation investment returns. And this is one of the main reasons that from 1958 to 89, when the previous government did this, why they stopped it in 1989. Although they did a lot of positive with it. I mean, they created Sasol, they created Eskom, they created eScore, they created all these infrastructure projects with that money. The investors were getting much less than inflation returns on the investment. So it wasn't in the investors' best interest anymore. And that's why they stopped that prescribed assets at that point. The other negative is that investors and pension funds will then be forced to invest in poor performing entities. So there won't be any due diligence being done on these entities. So because the choice is taken away, you can't go and say, well, let's look at this company, let's look at their fiscal policies, let's make sure what the returns are going to be, and then we make a decision whether we want to invest or not. All of those due diligence gets taken away, which means that money will flood to these entities without the necessary merits attached to it. And that in itself creates a problem in the entities, because if the entities are going to receive the money, no matter their performance, no matter how good or bad they manage their finances, there's no incentive for them to improve their management, to improve the way that they handle their finances, etc., etc. So it creates this negative spiral of giving money to people that's not deserving of the money, which means they waste more money, and then you are forced to give them more money. And we've already seen with a company like South African Airways how that ends up, and that's probably what's going to happen. Another thing is that because of the forcing of money into a certain direction and not allowing the market to choose where this money needs to go, more deserving projects might not get funding. Projects that would have a much more viable opportunity to create investment returns for investors could potentially not get funding because these funds are forced to invest money into government bonds. Okay, so those are some of the negatives. So the question is it going to happen? Now, the ANC said, no, it is not going to happen. They don't have it on their agenda. They are not planning to do prescribed assets, but they are, or they will be considering it. So you can already see the contradiction there. So it is not on the agenda at the moment, but they will consider it if it needs be. My personal belief is that it will be a reality with us within the next 24 to 36 months. Prescribed assets will become part of our investment landscape within the next 24 to 36 months, I believe. It could happen even sooner, but I do think it's going to take about 24 months before we get there. Saying that, I do not think that it will be as bad as people make it out to be. Because here's the thing, guys, this is what I want to share with you and clear up today. It's not like the government is going to come, take all the money in your pension fund, and now it's sitting with them and they invest it and they run it and they do anything, and you have to trust that they're going to manage it correctly. That's not the case. That's not how it's going to be. It's going to be a percentage of funds that will have to be put into bonds. Now, at the moment, we do invest, take people's money and invest in government bonds in any case. It's one of your lowest risk investments that you can get, one that gives you the most stable investment return. So it's not like it's this new thing where a new fund is created where money will just go into a black hole. That's not what it's going to be. But there is a lot of negative detriments that will come through if this becomes a reality, and I do believe that it will become a reality. So what would my recommendation be? So the first thing I would say, guys, is do not start panicking. Don't go and start resigning at work and pulling all your money out of your pension fund and cancel all your RAs and make it paid up and pay all those fees. Don't panic as of yet. It's not necessary to go into that extremes. I would, on the other hand, consider investing in alternative avenues to invest in. I, for example, and again, it's not that I'm saying you should do exactly the same, but I, for example, would not go and put another 3,000 Rand a month into a retirement annuity at this stage. I would first wait. I would rather, if I want to have a compulsory savings plan, I would probably put money into an endowment or into an ETF or a unit trust fund instead of doing it through a retirement annuity. Now, you lose certain benefits when you don't put money into a retirement annuity for your pension. For example, you don't get the tax benefit, so you can't claim it back from tax at the end of the year. But that one is also a little bit overrated, as the money that you get out of the retirement annuity at the end of the term will be taxed in any case. So what you don't pay in tax now, you will pay in tax later. Secondly, one of the bigger ones is that the money that's sitting in a retirement annuity is protected against creditors. So if something goes wrong and you have money in a retirement annuity, they cannot attach that money. So that is a safeguard for you for retirement. So you lose that if you don't put more money into a retirement annuity and you put it into something like an endowment. So a retirement annuity is also taxed at a lower rate internal to the policy. So you get a little bit of tax relief inside the investment as well. But for now, my opinion would be to not put extra money into an RA. I would keep my retirement annuity as is at the moment, if that is affordable, and I've looked at my cash flow, etc., etc. But I would look at finding alternative avenues to invest, or alternative methods to invest. The reality of the situation is that savings alone has never been the answer to get to retirement. So if you are one of the people that were thinking that my pension fund at work or my retirement annuity is going to help me retire comfortably, you are in for a rude awakening. And I think that is probably the biggest positive about these prescribed asset rumors, because what it does is it makes us think about these things. Otherwise, we just keep going at the same rate. That's the same with this COVID lockdown. Just imagine what our lives were like 6 months ago or a year ago against what it's now, how we changed and adapted because we had to. If this lockdown didn't happen, this meeting would not have happened on Zoom. We would have arranged to have everybody drive somewhere at night and blah, 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 the whole thing. And we wouldn't even have thought about changing the way we do business and the way we communicate with people. And because of it, we have changed. And that comes with a positive. So I think the positive that we need to see in the government changing this and looking at these kind of things is that it makes us more aware of what's happening and makes us think of different ways to invest. And so savings alone is not the answer. You have to find alternative ways. And that is what we at iRetire and Retire Rich and Happy have been doing for the last 18 years, is developing processes and plans to help people to solve the retirement crisis, help people to get to financial retirement within 10 years. So if that is something that you want to find out more about, if it's something that's serious or important to you to solve your retirement problem and find alternative ways, we've created a 5-step process that you can follow. And we have a coaching program that takes you by the hand and teaches you and helps you to implement this 5 steps so that you can truly retire rich and happy in 10 years instead of doing it in 40 years. So guys, if you want to know what that is all about, you're welcome to email frikkie@retirehappy.co.za with your details, and Frikkie will send you the times that we have a presentation on Zoom regarding our coaching. And there we can explain exactly how this works, and you can see how we can help you even in these times where it's so difficult to reach financial retirement.